Hi, welcome to the bathtub, where when you hear this theme music, and we stop it really quick because we don't want to be sued by the Ringling Brothers. You know, this is a new episode. We started a new theme show here called the Short Story Roundabout. So, Short Story Roundabout, which is basically lately I've just been reading short stories, and I don't usually read one when I'm going on a riff of just short stories. I kind of read like 3 or 4 different writers at a time. At the moment, I've got about 6 or 8 books that have been piling up over the year, and I'm sort of finishing them and adding new ones. And that's it. That's the whole premise of the whole thing. And I was also going to remind everybody, because some people have forgotten, that we have something here at the bathtub called the International Bathing Alliance. This is an alliance of like-minded bathers all over the universe, all over the known universe, who like to read books in the bathtubs without any purpose, without any reason, who aren't studying for graduate exams or something like that, or doing their composition thesis for high school. It's just for reading for no good reason whatsoever. And if you join, we put your name on a Google map and we announce it on our Facebook page. That's the entirety. That's it. And if you want, we'll send you a certificate, a PDF of the certificate, and I'll put your name on it. It says here, Certificate of International Bathing. I copied this off some sort of template. Special Achievement in Meaningless Literary Endeavors. This one's for Boris Johnson. Way back in the 2020, you can get the certificate for yourself, or you can get it for somebody, like for grandma or somebody's special birthday. Like maybe grandma's turning 100 and you've gotten her every present you could possibly get her by now. She doesn't have this. She doesn't have this. And she probably spends a lot of time in the bathtub. So you get something like this for her. And the best part of it is it's a birthday present or a Christmas present that doesn't cost you anything. You don't have to pay a nickel. It's worthless, and you don't have to pay a nickel for it. So think about it. All you need to do is just write me here or check out our Ultimate Beginners Facebook page and write me directly. Don't be careful sending your emails. I warn you of this, because you get inundated with porn as soon as you put your email address anywhere. I mean, every week I post one of these, I'm inundated with Russian porn, Slavic porn. I get porn from all over. They're constantly the Spanish, Portuguese porn. They're just all over the thing. I have to click them all and get rid of them all before I'm seduced into watching some of this horrible stuff. So that's a long way of saying just join the International Bathing Alliance, and you will be just as rich as you already are, because you won't have to spend a nickel. And we'll put you on there. We'll announce it. If you want the PDF, you get that. And I'm mentioning that because we're planning a big round of exciting promos. I have some promos next week or 2 weeks from now, which means, of course, cheap jack. I'm trying to figure ways to do promos for me and for some other publications and writers that don't cost me any money, or cost me very little money, because that's how we do things at the bathtub. Anyway, that's a long preamble to get back to the short stories. Since last week, I finished this really, really wonderful book of stories. I've read many different volumes of selected stories by de Maupassant, and I think David Coward's volumes, particularly A Day in the Country and Other Stories, which is still in print, is my favorite one-volume introduction. You want to read everything by de Maupassant because he's just so good, and he's almost like Chekhov, almost never wrong, never misses a beat. And I love this book, and it had many stories I haven't read, or I read them and I forgot them. It also includes a lot of very short stories. So de Maupassant, like Chekhov, wrote lots of 4 to 6 page stories, and I hadn't read a lot of them. Usually the collections tend to include the longer stories, like Boule de Suif, or the great vampire story La Horla, which is also in this. And they tend to use those long stories. This has a lot of the short ones. For example, there's like a 3 or 4 page story about a guy a lot of these kind of upper class characters who have high opinions of themselves, and he gets himself involved in a duel. And it's just about the day before a duel, just the terror this guy goes through. It's a wonderful story. Another story in here, I'm just going to really briefly tell you some of these stories. There's a story in here called Bed 29. I don't remember it, but I think it's a famous one. And it's about a man who's during the Prussian War, and getting another upper class military character, and he's hanging out with a prostitute or a woman of loose morals, and they are very famous couple in Paris. Then he goes to war, and the Prussians take over Paris, and she sleeps with all of them and gets VD. And it's about him coming home to see her in the hospital. It's they're sad, they're funny, and they're tragic at the same time. I don't know anyone who can get all of those qualities going all the time. There's a story called Strolling, which is just about there's a lot of these characters, as in many of these writers like Dostoevsky and Gogol and Flaubert, all these and Zola. They're kind of lower rung, middle class people who work in some bureaucracy. They're clerks or something. And it's about a guy who's never going to have much money to enjoy his life. And he's walking around the streets. And it's a great story. I don't want to tell you any more than that, just looking at people. These are all 3 or 4 page stories. There's another horror. He wrote a lot of ghost stories, or at least a few ghost stories, I remember. And I'm pretty sure I read this one, but it's called The Little Roque Girl. And it's about finding a girl, a girl who's been murdered and raped in the woods, a 16-year-old girl. It's a grisly story, a very interesting story, and has a kind of ghostly element to it. Just every one of the stories is very different from each other, is the main thing. The story called Mademoiselle Pearl. There's a lot of stuff in here about people who were in love, but they couldn't be in love, like a man from a fairly well-off family, and they bring an orphan girl into the house, and he falls in love with her, and they fall in love with each other. And, of course, they can't marry because she has no background. No one knows who she is. I won't tell you the rest of the story. They all end, and they satisfy you in a way. And some of them are actually have sort of cheerful endings. I think that's all I'll say about these. There's 2 or 3 very short stories which take place in courts. And I don't know whether he based them on real stories or not, but they're about people who are indicted for murder, both of the stories, and the tragic life they led before the murder. I don't want to tell you that, and there's actually a 1-sentence conclusion to each story, which is kind of brilliant. I liked very, very short stories. And then there's the Lahorla, which I think means the outsider, or it's kind of a word that he made up. It has some incredible passages in it. I'm going to read. I did tag a little bit, and it kind of gets at the kind of just general ennui of people in these urban settings, and this character who starts to feel that something's watching him, and he thinks it's some creature. He doesn't know what it is. There's no explanation at all. He just feels he's haunted. And the guy who's writing the diary says, "What is the cause of those mysterious influences which convert our happiness into dejection and turn optimism to anguish? It is as though the air we cannot see, were full of unknowable powers with mysterious force fields which affect us in some way. I can wake up as cheerful as you could wish, with songs in my heart and an urge to sing them. Why? I go for a stroll along the river bank, and then, for no reason, after walking no distance at all, I turn back feeling very down, as though something terrible were waiting for me when I got home. Why?" And the whole story, in the course of this vampiric presence out there that's coming at him, is this just general philosophical interest in how our moods change. So they're just wonderful stories. I strongly recommend this one. Great introduction as well. My other stories I've been reading this week, for about 2 or 3 weeks, are the Doonesbury Chronicles. These are 4-panel short stories, each single strip of Doonesbury. I started reading these when they came out in the early 70s. The Watergate hearings are in this one. It starts off with the kind of hippies that I was kind of growing up with and would like to have associated with more if I was very social when I was a kid. But I loved reading this Doonesbury's. This was back when I still read the newspaper every day. And I probably read this volume. This is the first volume, the Doonesbury Chronicles. It's been reissued over the decades in many different editions. I prefer these. It's kind of hard to get the complete Doonesbury, but it has all the friends like Mike and Mark, the guy who's the shaggy guy who works at the radio station, whose dad is wealthy and hates paying his tuition. And there's lots of color stuff. And there's lots of funny stuff about the Watergate hearings and Nixon and that whole sick crew he was hanging out with. It still reads really wonderful, and I read a lot of these at night usually before I go to bed. I've always wanted to go back to read the whole series because I lost track. The thing that's happened to the daily strip is that most of us don't get the newspaper anymore. And when I moved to London, I would buy the newspaper 3 or 4 times a week, and I would lose track of they actually ran Doonesbury, I think. I remember seeing it. But you'd lose track of the sequence, and you really need to read it every day to keep in it. So I kind of always wanted to go back and read all the way through. I do think he's a wonderful storyteller. He's got lovely characters, great dialogue, and they're great short stories. Finally, I'm rereading another one of those childhood favorites for various reasons, and that's called The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. I like these little Ballantine editions. Aren't those cool? I should tell you who the illustrator was on that. I don't think it says on this one. Anyway, he did this Valentine editions, which are in the 70s as well. I've got the other ones, The Study in Scarlet and The Sign of the Four. Probably the first book a kind of grown-up book I ever bought when I was 6 or 7. I remember saving my $2 or something. It was at a used bookstore, and I bought a big book called The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And it wasn't complete by any means, but it did contain A Study in Scarlet and most of these stories, and most of the stories in the other, and many of the stories in the other collections. And when I was 6 or 7, I didn't understand half the words. I still loved those stories. And one of the things that's fascinating to me about Sherlock Holmes is how many people love him. There's a lot of people who hate mysteries, and there's Edmund Wilson. I just reread an essay by Edmund Wilson who wrote some very funny essays about how mysteries suck. He basically, one's called "Why Do People Read Detective Stories?" And he says in the middle of it, but of course Sherlock Holmes was great. Nabokov, Wilson's old buddy Nabokov, he loved Sherlock Holmes. Was always talking him up, and it's hard to hear anybody say he's not good. And when you reread him, you'll understand why. I just want to say a couple of quick things. First of all, The Sign of the Four I didn't like as a kid. We talked about this about a year or two ago, and when I reread it a year or two ago, it's great. It's really a good read. It has this kind of lapse in the middle. So you have Sherlock Holmes frames the story, and then in the middle there's a story by either the criminal or the victim who tells some history. It's very common structure in almost all the Sherlock Holmes stories. And the story about going back to the Mormons, and the Mormons are the bad guys in this book, is really quite a good story. And the whole thing holds together well. It's a great introduction to Sherlock Holmes. The sequel... Oh, sorry, that was A Study in Scarlet. This is A Study in Scarlet. Sorry. That's Study in Scarlet. This is Sign of the Four, which I also read not too long ago and we talked about. And it does the same structure, and it's really kind of annoying. It's got kind of some sort of tontine thing, some group of people who have some money hidden away from something. I forget. I got kind of bored through most of this story, and it's not as good as the other ones. However, when Doyle was hired to do the adventures, and I think the Strand paid him to write 6 or 10 of them or something like that. These are great. And almost all the great mythology, almost every story has such wonderful... It starts off great. It just carries you through. Most of these stories you'll remember. It starts off with Scandal in Bohemia, where the one woman who outsmarts him is in it. And they have so many lovely little bits. The Red-Headed League. I remember that. I read that as a 7-year-old. I read this whole book again when I was in undergrad in college for a class. I enjoyed it just as much in my 20s. And I'm in my 60s now. I'm just ripping through it. It's even when you know the solutions, the relationships between the two characters, the whole kind of the ambiance of London is really well done. And then you have all these lovely little bits where, for example, Holmes everyone he goes off on an adventure, he writes Watson and said, "Will you come with me?" And Watson's wife says, "Yeah, go somewhere. You're boring me. You're really depressed around the house. Get out of the house." And there's all this little relationship between all these people. Whenever someone comes in, they get Mrs. Watson to come up and get tea and stuff. And that whole little life, and the one of the many strokes of genius in these stories is this idea that Holmes is just bored. He's always looking for something to get excited about. He's a drug addict. That's one of the reasons why he's a drug addict. He plays music and plays the violin and all this stuff. And he's always excited if something happens that allows him to get out of his doldrums. And at the end of this wonderful, what's the one of the Redheaded League? That's a great story, where there's a league of people who are supposed to hire people with really bright red hair. It's a great story. And he says at the end of it, he solves this problem for a man. He says, "You saved me from ennui. Alas, I already feel it closing in upon me. My life is spent in one long effort to escape from the commonplaces of existence." That's Holmes explaining why he's a detective. And it's very similar, by the way, to Poe's detective, whose name just suddenly jumped out of my head. But anyway, the Poe, he borrows a lot from Poe's detective stories. And yet he makes them all just marvelous. So anyway, I'm about 2/3 of the way through this. I just finished rereading the Adventures of the Speckled Band. I must have read it 2 or 3 times as a kid, and it's scary. It was one of the few that was scary and it was exciting to read. So here's a book, any age, however old your nephew or niece or kid is, or how old you are right now. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. It's the collection as it was published in Doyle's lifetime, and the sequel to this is pretty good too. We'll get to that soon. That's it. Happy bathing. I went a little too long. All of these are great books to have. I would really definitely get these 3. And if you like Trudeau, Garry Trudeau, one of my favorites, Doonesbury Chronicles. No, that's Doonesbury. The Doonesbury Chronicles, the first volume from back in the 70s. Take care. Bye.